Charlotte Voss pressed the crumpled letter against her chest and made herself breathe. The words on that paper had promised her a new life. A husband, 4 children, a home on the frontier. What they hadn't promised was this: a man who looked at her like she might be a mistake he hadn't decided to make yet. She stepped down from that wagon into the dust and heat of a summer that already felt like a warning. If this story moves something in your heart, subscribe to our channel. Follow every part until the very end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The wagon stopped just past midday. Charlotte felt the heat before she felt anything else. That dry, pressing weight of a summer that had no mercy in it. She'd been traveling for 3 days out of Abilene, and every mile had stretched the silence between her and her own thoughts, until she couldn't tell the difference between anticipation and dread. She climbed down without waiting for the driver to help her. The first thing she saw was the cabin. It was small. Smaller than she'd imagined when she'd read John Tyndale's letter the 4th time, the 5th time, the 6th, sitting at her kitchen table back in Missouri, trying to convince herself this was a reasonable decision. 1 room, maybe 2. A porch that leaned slightly to the left, as though it had grown tired of holding itself straight. A fence that had started out white and given up. The second thing she saw was the children. They were watching her from the edge of the yard, 4 of them, staggered in height like steps on a staircase. The oldest, a girl with her father's dark eyes and her arms crossed tight across her chest, looked at Charlotte the way a woman twice her age would look at a stranger who'd walked uninvited into her house. The second child, a boy, stood slightly behind her with his thumbs hooked in his suspenders and his jaw set like he was preparing for something unpleasant. The 2 younger ones, another boy and a tiny girl clutching a corn-husk doll, stood closer together, the little one peeking from behind her brother's arm. Not one of them smiled. Charlotte straightened her back and made herself walk toward them. "You must be Emma," she said, looking at the oldest girl. The girl's chin lifted. "Yes, ma'am." "I'm Charlotte," she paused. "I imagine you already know that." "Papa told us you were coming." Emma's voice was flat and careful. She wasn't being rude, exactly. She was being measured. She was taking stock. "He said you'd be arriving today." He was right. Charlotte looked at each of the children in turn. "And you're William?" The boy with the suspenders gave a short nod. "Yes, ma'am." "Samuel?" The younger boy nodded too, more shyly. "And this must be Sarah." The little girl tucked herself further behind Samuel's arm, then seemed to fight against her own instinct and inched forward. She was 6 years old and had her father's same dark eyes and a smear of dirt across one cheek that nobody had thought to wipe off. She looked at Charlotte for a long moment with an expression that was far too serious for a child her age. "Are you going to stay?" Sarah asked. Charlotte felt the question land somewhere behind her ribs. "I plan to," she said. Sarah considered this. Then, without another word, she stepped forward and slipped her small hand into Charlotte's. Emma's eyes flickered, just for a second, just a crack in that careful composure, before she pulled it back together. She turned her head toward the cabin. "Papa's around back," she said. "I'll take your bag." John Tyndale came around the corner of the cabin with a hammer in his hand and sweat soaking through the back of his shirt. He stopped when he saw her. Charlotte had spent some time, during those 3 days of traveling, trying to construct an image of what this man would look like. She'd read his letter enough times to nearly memorize it. But letters didn't tell you how a man stood, or what his face did when something surprised him. She'd pictured someone older, maybe. Harder. More worn down. He wasn't old. He wasn't worn down. He was tall and lean, with a kind of stillness about him that came from a life spent outdoors. The kind of man who moved deliberately, who didn't waste motion. His face was weathered and angular, and there was something behind his eyes that she couldn't name right away. Not coldness, more like caution. The kind of caution that comes after something has already gone wrong. He set the hammer down against the fence post. "Miss Voss," he said. "Mr. Tyndale." She held out her hand. He looked at her for just a beat too long before he shook it. His grip was firm and brief. "You made good time," he said. "The roads were clear." He nodded. His eyes moved over her once, not unkindly, but thoroughly, the way a man checks a piece of fence line for weak spots before he trusts it with any weight. "You're smaller than I expected," he said. Charlotte blinked. "I beg your pardon?" Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "Didn't mean anything by it. Just an observation." He picked the hammer back up. "Emma will show you where you'll sleep. Supper's at sundown. We eat what we grow, and we don't waste." He turned back to the fence. Charlotte stood there a moment, watching his back. "Mr. Tyndale," she said. He glanced over his shoulder. "I didn't come all this way to be an observation," she said. "I came to be a wife. To these children, and to you if you'll have me. But I want to be plain with you from the start. I don't do well with being managed." The hammer went still against the post. John turned around fully this time. He looked at her with that same careful, unhurried attention, and for the first time she saw something in his expression that wasn't caution. It was closer to interest. "Noted," he said, and went back to work. That first evening told her more than any letter could have. The children worked without being told. Emma moved through the kitchen with a quiet efficiency that belonged to someone who had been running a household far longer than a 13-year-old should have been. William hauled water. Samuel fed the animals. Even little Sarah carried things. Small things, slowly, with enormous concentration. Her tongue pressed to her bottom lip as she walked. They had a system. They built it themselves, out of necessity, and it worked. And Charlotte understood immediately that she was not yet part of it. She asked Emma what she could do to help. "You can sit," Emma said, without looking up from the pot. "I'd rather not." Emma turned her head, looked at her. "You can set the table," she said. "Plates are on the second shelf. We only have 5, so don't break any." Charlotte set the table. Supper was beans and cornbread, and it was plain, and it was enough. And nobody spoke much until Samuel, his mouth still half full, pointed at Charlotte and said, "Can you read?" "Samuel," Emma's voice was sharp. "I'm just asking." He turned back to Charlotte. "Can you?" "I can," Charlotte said. "Papa can't," Samuel said matter-of-factly. "Not very well. He makes Emma read the letters." The table went quiet. John looked at his son with an expression that didn't change, but somehow went very still. Charlotte looked at John. "That's so," she said. John picked up his coffee cup. "Boy talks too much," he said. "I read to myself every night before bed," Charlotte said. "I have 3 books in my bag. If you'd like, Samuel, I could read aloud after supper." Samuel's face lit up so fast it was almost painful to look at. "Could you?" "If your father has no objection." John said nothing for a long moment. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. Then, "Fine by me," he said, "as long as the chores are done first." Sarah, who had been very quietly eating her beans, looked up at Charlotte with those enormous dark eyes. "Will you read about horses?" she asked. "I have a story that has a horse in it," Charlotte said. Sarah nodded slowly, as though this was exactly the correct answer, and went back to her beans. Later, after the children were asleep and the cabin was quiet, Charlotte sat on the porch in the cooling dark and tried to make an accounting of what she'd gotten herself into. She heard the screen door and John came out and stood at the edge of the porch, with his arms crossed, and his gaze out toward the flat dark of the plain. "I want to be honest with you," he said, without looking at her, "about what this is." Charlotte waited. "I'm not a man who's easy to know," he said. "I've been told that enough times that I reckon it's true. These children need a mother, a real one, not someone playing at it." "I know what I came here for," Charlotte said. "Do you?" It wasn't quite a question. "Because the life here is hard, Miss Voss. The land's dry. The work don't stop. I can't offer you things that—" He paused. Something crossed his face that she couldn't read. "I can't offer you much beyond what you see." Charlotte looked out at the dark the same way he was looking at it. "Mr. Tyndale," she said, "I had a comfortable life in Missouri. I had a house with curtains and a neighbor who brought preserves every Sunday. And I was lonely in every single room of that house." She turned to look at him. "I'm not here for things. I'm here because those 4 children in there need someone, and because your letter was the most honest piece of writing I've ever read from a man I'd never met." He turned his head to look at her then. There was something in his expression that was almost nakedly surprised, like he'd been expecting a different answer and hadn't prepared himself for the one she gave. "Go inside," he said after a moment. "It's late." Charlotte stood. She smoothed her skirt. "Good night, Mr. Tyndale," she said. "Good night," he said. She went inside. He stayed on the porch for a long time after. 3 days into it, Charlotte understood that she was being watched. Not by the children, though they watched her too, each in their own way. Emma watched her with that steady, guarded assessment. Samuel watched her the way he watched everything, with pure, hungry curiosity. William watched her from a careful distance, like he'd decided to reserve judgment and hadn't moved off that position yet. And Sarah watched her with something that looked almost like recognition, as if some part of that 6-year-old knew something that the rest of them hadn't figured out yet. But the watching she was talking about was John. He was subtle about it. She'd given that. He didn't stare. He went about his work the way he always did, early up, long hours, few words. But there were moments when she'd glance up from whatever she was doing and catch the tail end of his attention shifting away. Little tests. She started to notice them. Whether she flinched at the hard work, whether she complained about the heat, whether she was softer with one child than the others. She was not soft with Emma. She understood that Emma didn't want softness. What Emma wanted was respect, and Charlotte gave it to her plainly, asking her opinions on things, deferring to her on small household matters, treating her less like a child and more like the small adult she'd been forced to become. Emma didn't warm to her, but she stopped looking at her like a threat. William was harder. William was silent and proud and had the particular stubbornness of a boy who has decided that loving someone is a risk he's already assessed and decided against. Charlotte didn't push him. She handed him things. She worked alongside him when he'd let her. She asked him questions about the horses. He knew them well, better than the others, and let him talk without interrupting. After a week, he started answering before she finished asking. It was on a Thursday. She knew it was Thursday because Emma kept a careful calendar on the inside of the kitchen cabinet door. That John came back from town, and Charlotte was reading to Samuel and Sarah on the porch steps. And she looked up and saw something in his face that she couldn't quite name. He was looking at her. Not the way a man looks at a woman he's assessing. Something different. Something she didn't have a word for yet. He turned away before she could find one. "Papa don't talk much," Samuel told her that evening, very seriously, while she was helping him with the water barrel. "He talked more before Mama died. Emma says so. Charlotte looked at him. When did your mama pass? 3 years ago. Samuel hoisted his end of the barrel without apparent difficulty. He was 9 years old and already strong in the way frontier boys got strong, through necessity and repetition. It was in the winter. She got sick, and then she got worse, and then she was gone. He said it the way children say things that have been said many times, not without feeling, but with the feeling worn smooth from handling. Papa didn't talk for about a month. Emma says she was scared. I was scared too, but I didn't say. Charlotte set her end of the barrel down. Samuel, she said, I think it was very brave of you to come and meet me when I arrived. Samuel squinted at her. Why? Because you didn't know me at all. And that takes courage. He thought about this. Then he picked up his end of the barrel again. You're not like I thought you'd be, he said. What did you think I'd be? He shrugged one shoulder. A stranger. He glanced at her sidelong. You're still kind of a stranger, but a less strange one. Charlotte laughed. It was the first time she'd laughed since she'd arrived, and the sound seemed to surprise them both. Samuel grinned. It was John's grin, the same architecture, the same reluctant quality, but on a 9-year-old, it was unguarded and genuine, and Charlotte felt something in her chest shift slightly, like a door settling on new hinges. She found the letters by accident. She wasn't snooping. She had been asked by Emma, with stiff, carefully maintained formality, to go to the back room and retrieve the spare wool blanket, because Sarah had been coughing at night, and the nights were cooling faster than expected. Charlotte went into the back room, found the chest along the far wall, opened it. The blanket was there. Underneath it was a bundle of letters, tied with cord, sitting on top of what looked like a folded legal document. The document's top edge was visible past the fold, and on it, in clear ink, she could read 3 words before she looked away. Tyndale Ranch, Estate. She stood there for a moment longer than she should have. Then she took the blanket and closed the chest and went back to the front room and gave Emma the blanket and said nothing at all. But she thought about those 3 words for the rest of that evening. She thought about them while she read to the children. She thought about them while she cleared the supper dishes. She thought about them while John sat at the table, going over what she assumed were figures, numbers he'd never explained to her, papers he always folded away before she came close. She thought about the way he watched her. She thought about the specific and deliberate quality of his poverty, the way he mentioned the limits of their resources with a precision that seemed rehearsed, the way he never quite met her eyes when he talked about what he could and could not offer her. She did not say anything. But that night on the porch, sitting in the dark with the summer air finally loosening to something that felt like it could breathe, she looked at John Tyndale's profile and wondered, for the first time, with a clarity that felt like a cold glass of water, what exactly she had married, and whether he was ever going to trust her enough to tell her. "You're quiet tonight," John said. Charlotte didn't look at him. "I'm thinking." "About what?" "About what honesty looks like," she said, "between 2 people who don't know each other yet." Silence. The kind of silence that has weight. "I reckon it looks different for different people," he said. "I reckon it does." She turned to look at him then. "Are you honest with me, Mr. Tyndale?" He held her gaze. His jaw tightened once. "I don't lie," he said. "That's not the same thing," Charlotte said. He had no answer for that. She went inside. John stayed on the porch and looked out at the darkness of his land, at the acres and acres of it that she didn't know about, at the house that stood 2 miles east that she'd never seen, at the name on a deed that would have changed everything about why she'd come. And he told himself, as he had told himself since the day her first letter arrived in his mailbox, that he was doing this for the right reasons. He told himself that, and the night was warm, and somewhere inside the cabin, his youngest daughter coughed once and went quiet. And John Tyndale sat with the weight of what he was keeping from the woman he'd brought into his home, and felt, for the first time, but not the last, that what he had called caution might, in another man's honest vocabulary, be called something else entirely. The next morning, Charlotte was up before the sun. Not because she couldn't sleep. She'd slept, eventually, the way a person sleeps when their mind finally exhausts itself trying to solve something it doesn't have enough pieces for. She was up because Emma was already up, moving quietly in the kitchen with a particular efficiency of someone who had been doing this long enough that she didn't need light to do it. Charlotte heard her and got up, and that was that. Emma didn't say anything when Charlotte appeared. She just moved slightly to the left to make room at the counter. Charlotte took that as the invitation it was. They worked in silence for a while. Emma mixing the morning cornmeal, Charlotte building up the fire, each of them orbiting the same small space without collision. It was the most comfortable Charlotte had felt since arriving. There was something in working beside someone that didn't require words, and she was grateful for it. Then Emma said, without looking up from what she was doing, "You look through Papa's chest." Charlotte went very still. "I wasn't snooping," she said. "I know." Emma's voice was flat and careful, the way it always was. "I saw you come back with the blanket. You had a look on your face." "What kind of look?" Emma glanced at her sideways. "The kind people get when they find something they weren't supposed to." She turned back to the cornmeal. "I've seen it before." Charlotte set down what she was holding. "Have other people found things in that chest?" Emma was quiet for long enough that Charlotte thought she wasn't going to answer. "Papa had a woman come out here 2 summers ago," Emma said at last. Her voice was careful. "Before you. She didn't stay long. She found out about—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "She left the next morning." Charlotte looked at the girl's profile. 13 years old, carrying something she shouldn't have to carry. What did she find out? Emma shook her head, one small, decisive movement. "That's not mine to say." She turned fully to look at Charlotte then, and for the first time there was something in her face that wasn't assessment, or caution, or carefully maintained distance. It was something closer to a question. "Are you going to leave?" Charlotte held the girl's gaze. "Not over a document I only read 3 words of," she said. Emma looked at her for another long moment. Then she turned back to the cornmeal. "Good," she said, and didn't say anything else about it. But when William came in 10 minutes later, Emma handed him his breakfast and said, in a tone so casual it was almost deliberate, "Charlotte's staying." William looked at Charlotte, then at his plate. "Didn't say she wasn't," he said, but his shoulders dropped a 1/4 inch, and Charlotte noticed. John came in from the field at mid-morning with a look on his face that told her something had gone wrong before he opened his mouth. "Water line's damaged," he said to Emma. "We'll need to pull from the well today." "How bad?" Emma asked. "Bad enough." He pulled off his hat and set it on the hook by the door. "William, I need you on the pump. Samuel, you're with me." He looked at Charlotte. "You know how to manage a household on short water?" "Yes," Charlotte said. He looked at her with that same unreadable expression he always carried, the one she'd been trying to parse since she arrived. And then he nodded once. "Then you're in charge of rationing until I say otherwise." He went back out. Charlotte turned to Emma. "How much do we have stored?" Emma was already counting. 3 barrels, maybe 2.5 after last night." "Then we make it last 4 days," Charlotte said. "What do we use the most of?" "Cooking, washing the animals." "Animals can wait," Charlotte said. "People first." Emma nodded slowly. Papa usually puts the animals first. Well, Charlotte picked up the ladle. Papa's not in the kitchen. Emma almost smiled. She didn't, but she almost did, and Charlotte counted that as a kind of victory she hadn't earned yet, but was getting closer to. The morning moved fast and hard, the way mornings on a working homestead did, with no pause between one task and the next. Charlotte rationed and organized and made herself useful in every way she could think of, and by the time noon hit, she was covered in dust and her back was aching, and she felt, for the first time since arriving, something that wasn't anxiety, something that felt more like purpose. Sarah found her behind the cabin, rinsing out the smaller water bucket. "Charlotte," Sarah said. "Yes, baby." "Is Papa mad?" Charlotte looked down at her. "About the water line?" "He's worried, not mad. There's a difference." Sarah considered this with extraordinary seriousness. "He makes the same face for both." "I know," Charlotte said. "But watch his hands. When he's mad, his hands go still. When he's worried, he keeps moving." She handed Sarah the small bucket to carry. "Your papa's a man who works through trouble. That's not the worst thing a person can be." Sarah carried the bucket with both hands, tongue between her teeth. "My mama used to say he worked too much," she said. Charlotte walked beside her and didn't say anything. "Do you think that's bad?" Sarah asked. "I think," Charlotte said carefully, "that when people lose things, they sometimes hold on very hard to the things they've still got. Work is something your papa can hold on to." She paused. "I don't think that's bad. I think it's just human." Sarah thought about this for a long time, long enough that they'd gotten back to the front of the cabin before she spoke again. "I think you're smart," she said finally. Charlotte laughed. "Well, thank you, Sarah." "You're welcome," Sarah said, handed off the bucket with great ceremony, and went to find her corn-husk doll. That was when Charlotte heard it. Not loud, just the low, careful sound of two male voices around the far side of the cabin, held close so they wouldn't carry. She wasn't trying to listen. She wasn't. But the name she heard stopped her the way a hand on the shoulder stops a person, immediate and involuntary. "Tyndale Ranch," a man was saying, a voice she didn't recognize, older, rougher than John's. "The deed's been sitting at Heller's office for 3 months now, John. You can't keep putting this off." "I'm not putting it off," John said. "The hell you aren't." A pause. "The whole county knows your daddy's estate was passed to you. You think they don't talk? You think the woman you just brought in doesn't have ears?" "She doesn't know anything," John said. His voice was flat. Charlotte didn't breathe. "She's going to find out," the other man said. "Women always do. And when she does, she's going to wonder why you didn't tell her. And then she's going to wonder what else you didn't tell her." Another pause. "Is that what you want?" Silence. A long one. "I need to know she's here for the right reasons," John said, and his voice was so low she almost didn't catch it. "I need to know she ain't like—" "She ain't Miriam," the man said bluntly. The name landed like a stone in still water. "You don't know that yet," John said. "No," the man agreed. "But you're not going to find out by hiding from her." Footsteps. The crunch of boots on dry ground. "Think on it, John. That's all I'm saying. Think on it." Charlotte moved away from the wall before the footsteps got any closer. She went back inside, set down what she was carrying, and stood at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the wood and made herself breathe evenly. Miriam. A name she hadn't heard before, a name that had made John's voice go different, harder and more careful, the way a man's voice goes when he's protecting a wound he doesn't want touched. She didn't ask about it that evening. She filed it away in the same place she'd filed the 3 words on that document, and she waited, and she watched, and she went about the business of being useful in a home that hadn't yet decided whether or not she belonged in it. It was William who cracked first, and she hadn't seen it coming. She'd been working with him in the small storage area beside the cabin, reorganizing the supply shelves, because Emma had asked her to, and Charlotte had said yes. William worked beside her in his usual silence, not unfriendly silence anymore, just his natural mode, compact and contained. And they'd been at it for nearly an hour when he picked up a glass jar, turned it over in his hands, and said without any preamble at all, "My mama was beautiful." Charlotte stopped moving. "I expect she was," she said. William set the jar down carefully. "She laughed a lot, more than Papa." He didn't look at Charlotte. His voice was flat in the way 11-year-old boys make their voices flat when they're saying something that costs them. "She used to sing when she cooked. I don't remember the songs anymore." A pause. Just that there were songs. Charlotte didn't speak. She understood this wasn't a conversation. This was a boy laying something down in front of her and watching to see what she'd do with it. "She sounds like someone worth remembering," Charlotte said. William was quiet. Then, "Emma says you're different from the last one." "The last one?" Charlotte kept her voice even. "The woman who came before you." His jaw worked once. "She was from the city. She talked a lot. Didn't work much." He shrugged one shoulder. "Papa sent her away after 3 days." Charlotte turned to look at him directly. "Did he?" She kept asking about the ranch. William finally met her eyes. His were John's eyes exactly. Dark and direct and carrying more than he meant to show. Every time Papa turned around, she was asking about property and money and what he owned. His voice hardened. "Papa doesn't like that." Charlotte held his gaze. "What does your papa like?" William thought about it. Genuinely thought, in the careful, unhurried way of a boy who doesn't speak unless he has something worth saying. "He likes honest work," William said at last. "He likes when the horses are treated right. He likes when Sarah laughs." He paused. "He liked when Mama sang." Charlotte nodded slowly. "Thank you for telling me that," she said. William looked at her for one more moment. Then he turned back to the shelves. "The jars go label side out," he said. "Emma's particular about it." "Label side out," Charlotte agreed, and went back to work. That evening, John came to supper, looking like a man who'd been arguing with himself all day and hadn't settled on a winner. He was quieter than usual, which was saying something, and twice Charlotte caught him looking at her with an expression that had shifted from the careful assessment of the first days into something more complicated, something with more conflict in it. After supper, after the children were settled and the cabin quieted, he didn't go to the porch the way he usually did. He sat at the table. Charlotte was washing the last of the dishes. She heard the chair scrape back and glanced over her shoulder and saw him sitting there with his hands folded and his eyes on the table, not on her. And something about his posture told her he was working himself up to something. She finished the dishes and dried her hands and sat down across from him. He didn't look up right away. When he did, his jaw was set. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right. Why did you answer my letter?" Charlotte looked at him. "I told you already. I was lonely. I thought—" "Not the easy answer," he said. "The real one." She held his gaze. It was a harder question than it sounded, and they both knew it. And she took a moment to give it the respect it deserved. "My husband died 4 years ago," she said. "We didn't have children. We tried. It didn't happen." She kept her voice steady. "After he died, I had the house and the neighbor with the preserves, and I had a life that was perfectly comfortable and completely empty. And one night I was reading, and I thought—" She stopped, looked at her hands. "I thought, if I died tomorrow, What would be left? What would have mattered? She looked back up at him. Your letter said you had 4 children who needed someone. That felt like a reason, a real one. John was very still. You're not afraid of them, he said, of taking on someone else's... They're not someone else's anything, Charlotte said. They're children. They just need someone to show up and stay. She paused. I intend to stay. John looked at her for a long time. She couldn't read what was in his face. There were too many layers to it, too many things moving beneath the surface. He was a man fighting something. She could see that clearly now. Something in him wanted to move toward her, and something else was holding him back hard. My first wife, he said, and then stopped. Charlotte waited. She married me under false pretenses, he said. His voice was careful and controlled. She had circumstances she didn't tell me about. Debts. Other people she owed herself to. He pressed his jaw together. By the time I knew, there were 4 children and a life that was already built, and He stopped again. I don't hold it against her. She's gone now, and I've made my peace with it. He looked directly at Charlotte. But I learned something about knowing who a person really is before you trust them with your whole life. There it was, not the whole truth, but the edge of it. Close enough that Charlotte could feel the shape of what he wasn't saying. So you test them, she said. His expression shifted. I make sure, he said. Charlotte felt something rise in her chest. Not quite anger, not quite grief. Something between them, something that had weight and heat. And what exactly have you been making sure of? She said. Because I've been here almost 2 weeks, John, and I've worked every day, and I've been honest every time you've asked me to be. And I haven't asked you once about what you own, or what you have, or what this life is worth in dollars. Her voice was steady, but her hands were flat on the table and pressing down. So I'd like to know, what is it you're waiting for me to do before you decide I'm worth trusting? John opened his mouth, closed it. I'm not a test, Charlotte said. I'm a person. And if you can't tell the difference between those 2 things yet, then I'd say the problem isn't mine. She pushed back her chair and stood up. Good night, Mr. Tyndale, she said. John sat at the table and watched her go, and his hands, which had been still, perfectly still the whole conversation, slowly uncurled. She was nearly asleep when she heard the knock at her door, small, tentative. She got up and opened it. Sarah was standing in the dark in her nightgown with her corn-husk doll pressed to her chest and her eyes enormous. I had a bad dream, she said. Charlotte stepped back from the door without hesitation. Come in, baby. Sarah climbed into the bed with the certainty of a child who has decided something and is no longer negotiating about it. She tucked herself against Charlotte's side with her doll between them and was quiet for a moment. Charlotte, she whispered. I think Papa likes you. Charlotte was quiet. He watches you, Sarah said. Like he's afraid you're going to disappear. Charlotte lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about a man who hid what he owned and tested what he loved and sat at the table with his hands so carefully still. And she thought about a name she'd heard through a wall. And she thought about 4 children who had built a whole system for surviving without needing anyone new. And she thought about William saying he liked when Mama sang. Go to sleep, Sarah, she said softly. Sarah yawned enormously. Don't disappear, she said. I won't, Charlotte said, and meant it, even though she was starting to understand, in the particular specific way of women who were paying attention, that the man in the next room was not giving her the whole story, that the life she'd been shown was not the whole life, that somewhere on this land There was something John Tyndale had decided she hadn't yet earned the right to know. And she was going to have to decide, when that something finally came to light, whether the reason he'd kept it from her was one she could live with, or one that would change everything. She didn't sleep well after that. Sarah had drifted off within minutes, that complete and trusting way children sleep when they feel safe. And Charlotte had lain there in the dark with the girl's small weight against her side, and her mind running like a creek that had nowhere to empty itself. She kept coming back to the same things: the document in the chest, the conversation she hadn't been meant to hear, the way John had sat at that table with his hands folded and his jaw set, and given her just enough truth to feel like honesty, without actually being it. She was not a foolish woman. She had never been a foolish woman. And she was starting to feel like she was being treated like one. By morning, she had made a decision. She wasn't going to wait anymore. She was going to ask him directly. Not about the document, not yet. Not about the estate or the deed or whatever it was sitting in Heller's office for 3 months. She was going to ask him about Miriam. Because that name had been in his voice like a splinter, and until she understood what it meant, she was operating blind, and she refused to operate blind any longer. She got up, set Sarah gently aside without waking her, and went to the kitchen. John was already gone. His coffee cup was rinsed and sitting upside down on the counter. He always did that, she'd noticed. Rinsed his own cup and left it upside down like a closed door. And through the window, she could hear the sounds of him already at work, somewhere outside. Emma came in from the back with eggs. She took one look at Charlotte's face and set the basket down. "What happened?" Emma said. "Nothing happened," Charlotte said. Emma looked at her with those dark, too old eyes. "You have the same face you had when you came back with the blanket." Charlotte looked at the girl steadily. "Emma, who was Miriam?" The silence that followed was so complete that Charlotte could hear the chickens outside. Emma's face didn't change, but her hands, which had been moving to sort the eggs, went completely still. "Where did you hear that name?" Emma said. "Does it matter?" Emma turned away, picked up an egg, put it down. "She was our mother," she said. Her voice was flat and controlled, the exact same register she used when she was working hardest to feel nothing. "Her name was Miriam." Charlotte let out a slow breath. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't know her name. Your father never... Papa doesn't say it." Emma's back was still to her. "He hasn't said it since she died. Not once." She paused. "Not to us. Not to anyone." Charlotte looked at the back of the girl's head, at the careful braid she'd put in her own hair that morning. The small, serious business of a 13-year-old who did everything for herself. "He loved her very much," Charlotte said. It wasn't a question. Emma's shoulders moved once. Not quite a shrug, not quite a flinch. "He did." A pause. "She didn't make it easy." Charlotte waited. Emma turned around. Her face was still composed, but her eyes had something in them now. Something that had been held in long enough that it was pressing against the surface. "She was kind," Emma said carefully. "She was. But she kept things from him. Things about money she owed before they married. People who came to collect it." Her jaw tightened. "It caused trouble. Bad trouble. For a long time." She looked directly at Charlotte. "Papa handled it. He always handles things. But it changed him." Charlotte held the girl's gaze. "It made him stop trusting people." Emma nodded once, looked back at the eggs. "He's not a bad man," she said quietly. "I need you to know that. Whatever he does, however he acts, he's not a bad man. He's just..." She stopped. "Scared," Charlotte said. Emma said nothing. but the tightness around her eyes loosened by a fraction, and Charlotte understood that was as close to agreement as Emma Tyndale was going to get. She found him at the fence line, the same fence line where he'd been working the day she arrived, as if some things just kept needing to be fixed, no matter how many times you came back to them. He heard her coming and turned before she said a word. "Charlotte," he said, wary already. He could read something in the set of her walk. "I know her name was Miriam," Charlotte said. She stopped a few feet from him. Her voice was steady. "I know she kept things from you. I know it hurt you and cost you and changed something in you that hasn't come back yet." She held his gaze. "I'm not Miriam, John. I need you to understand that." The name in her mouth made his whole face shift. He looked like a man who had just been handed something sharp without warning. "I never said you were," he said. "You're acting like I am," Charlotte said. "Every test you've been running me through, the poverty, the distance, the way you watch me when you think I'm not looking. That's not about me. That's about her." Her voice didn't waver. "And I understand it. I do. What she did to you was real, and what it cost you was real. But I came here in good faith, and I have worked every day in good faith, and I deserve better than to be measured against a ghost." John stood very still. "I'm not—" He stopped, started again. "I'm not measuring you against anyone." "Then what are you doing?" she said. He looked away. His hand tightened around the hammer he was holding. "Trying to be sure," he said, low, almost to himself. "Sure of what?" Charlotte pressed. "That I'm not going to leave? That I'm not after something? What is it, John? Because I have been here nearly 3 weeks, and I have not asked you once about money or land or what you own. I have cooked and cleaned and carried water and read to your children every night, and I have not asked you for a single thing you haven't offered." Her voice broke for just a moment, just a crack, before she steadied it. "So I need you to tell me what it is I'm still failing to prove." John turned back to her. His jaw worked. The look on his face was one she hadn't seen before. Not the caution, not the closed-off assessment. This was raw. This was something he hadn't intended her to see. "It's not about failing," he said. "Then what is it about?" He opened his mouth, and then, from across the yard, William shouted, "Papa! Rider coming in fast!" The rider was a man named Gerald Holt, and Charlotte had never seen him before. But from the way John's whole body changed when he saw him, going rigid and braced, the way a man goes rigid when trouble he's been expecting finally shows up, she understood that this was not a welcome arrival. Holt pulled up his horse and climbed down with the ease of a man comfortable on other people's property. He was broad and well-dressed by frontier standards, and he had the particular quality of men who are accustomed to being listened to, the way they take up space without asking permission. He looked at John, then at Charlotte. "So it's true," he said. "You did bring a woman in." "This is my wife," John said. His voice was flat. Holt looked Charlotte over in a way that wasn't quite rude, but was close enough to be deliberate. "Ma'am," he said, turned back to John. "I need to speak with you, privately." "Anything you say to me, you can say in front of Charlotte," John said. Something flickered across Holt's face. Recalibration. He hadn't expected that. He'd expected John to step aside, to take the conversation away from her, and John hadn't moved. Holt smiled slowly. "All right, then." He pulled an envelope from his coat. "The original terms your father set for the estate transition expire at the end of summer. That's 6 weeks." He held out the envelope. If you haven't formally assumed the deed by then, the secondary clause activates. The ranch goes to the county land board for dispersal. Charlotte did not look at John. She kept her eyes on Holt. 6 weeks, John said. 6 weeks. Holt's gaze slid to Charlotte again. Course, there are those of us in town who'd be happy to take that land off the county's hands if it comes to that. Progress and all. He smiled again. I imagine your new bride might have thoughts on the matter. My wife's thoughts are her own business, John said. The hammer was still in his hand. He hadn't moved it. And so is this ranch. You can tell whoever sent you that the answer is the same as it's been. Holt looked at him for a long moment. Then he tipped his hat at Charlotte. Ma'am, he said again, climbed back on his horse, rode out. John stood with the envelope in his hand and didn't turn around. Charlotte stood behind him and waited. He turned. His face was a thing she had no word for. There was shame in it, clear, unmistakable shame. And beneath that, something older. Something that had been there a long time. Charlotte, he started. How big is it? She said. He stopped. The ranch, she said. How big is it? His jaw tightened. 4,000 acres, he said. Charlotte heard that number and kept her face still and her breathing even. And the house, she said. The one on the east side of the property. His eyes changed. You knew about that? I suspected, she said. How long have you owned it? Since my father died, 2 years ago. He looked at the envelope in his hand. I never lived in it. He stopped. I didn't want... He stopped again. You didn't want a woman to want you for it, Charlotte said. John said nothing. So you hid it, she said. You hid everything. And you brought me out here to live in a one-room cabin and watch your children do the work of adults, and you waited to see what I'd do when the money wasn't there. The silence stretched. Yes, he said. One word. Flat and honest and ashamed. Charlotte looked at him. She had been preparing herself, she realized. For the past several days, in the back of her mind, she'd been building toward this moment, stockpiling her composure against it. And even so, standing here with the actual weight of it in her hands, she felt something that she hadn't entirely predicted. Not rage, not devastation, something quieter than either of those. She felt tired. You put your children through this too, she said. Emma has been running that house since she was 10 years old, John. Samuel sleeps in a room the size of a closet. Sarah's cough gets worse every time the nights cool down because that cabin doesn't hold heat. Her voice was very even, very controlled. You had the means to fix all of that, and you didn't because you were... Testing, he said, and it sounded awful out loud. She could hear it on his face. Testing, she agreed. He looked at her with those eyes of his, those dark, careful, armored eyes, and for the first time she saw them without the armor, just the man underneath, raw and ashamed and waiting for the verdict. I can't defend it, he said. No, she said. You can't. She turned and walked back toward the cabin. The storm came in that afternoon. It had been building since morning. She'd felt it in the air, that particular thickness that came before the sky broke open, and by 3 o'clock, the light had gone that greenish-gray color that meant business. Emma started moving things inside without being told. William started closing up the storage. Even Samuel, who could usually be counted on to treat weather as an adventure, moved with the focused speed of a boy who had seen storms on this land before and knew what they could do. Charlotte worked beside them. She didn't speak. Her mind was working the way it worked when she was hurt. Not loudly, not dramatically, just steadily, turning things over, looking at them from every angle, trying to find the shape of what she was dealing with. John Tyndale had lied to her. Not in words. She believed him when he said he didn't lie. But there were things that were exactly as dishonest as lying, and he had done all of them, deliberately, with both hands. And yet, she thought about Emma telling her that he wasn't a bad man. She thought about Miriam, about a woman who had kept secrets, and what those secrets had cost a family she'd never met. She thought about John sitting at a table, watching wife after woman after stranger, waiting to see which one would show herself for what she actually was. She thought about the fact that he hadn't moved when Holt had asked to speak to him privately. He'd stood his ground and said, "Anything you say to me, you can say in front of Charlotte." She didn't know what to do with that. She was still working on it when the storm broke. It came hard and fast, the way summer storms in that country did. No preamble, just a wall of wind and then the rain coming sideways, and the whole world suddenly loud and close. The children scrambled. Charlotte caught Sarah under her arm as the little girl ran for the porch, shielding her with her body against the driving rain. Inside, everything was close and loud and soaked through at the edges. And Charlotte stood in the middle of it, getting the children settled. Sarah against her side, William slamming the shutter, Samuel holding the door against the wind. And she was operating on instinct now, pure maternal instinct that had been there her whole life and never have anywhere to go. And she was so focused on the children that she almost didn't notice the door opening. John came in. He was soaked through. His hat was gone, lost somewhere in the wind, and his hair was flattened against his head, and he was breathing hard, like he'd been running. He scanned the room with the rapid, specific focus of a man counting his people. And when he saw all 4 children safe, his breath came out of him like something he'd been holding since the storm started. Then he looked at Charlotte. She was standing with Sarah in her arms. Sarah had climbed up at some point, and Charlotte was holding her with one arm and had her other hand on Samuel's shoulder, and her face was steady and calm, the particular calm of a woman who is afraid, but will not perform it in front of children. John looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time. Not the cautious, measuring look of the past 3 weeks. Something different. Something that cracked straight through the caution and hit what was underneath. His face did something she'd never seen it do. It came open. Just for a second. Just long enough. Then Sarah said, "Papa, Charlotte kept me dry." And John crossed the room in 4 steps. He didn't touch Charlotte. He lifted Sarah from her arms, which he clearly intended to be a practical transfer. But Sarah threw her arms around his neck and said, "Papa," in the particular voice of a 6-year-old who has decided she's had enough adventure. And John held his daughter with his eyes closed for a moment, and Charlotte watched him hold her. She felt the anger shift, not dissolve, not disappear, but shift into something more complicated. She understood, suddenly and completely, what he had been so afraid of losing. The storm lasted 2 hours. They sat through it together in a way they haven't sat together yet. Close, in the small space of the cabin, with the rain crashing against the roof, and the children pressed in around the table, and nobody going anywhere. Emma made coffee. William found the old pack of cards and dealt a hand that nobody played very well, because everyone was too distracted. Samuel fell asleep, sitting up. Sarah refused to be set down until the rain stopped. John sat at the end of the table and said very little. But twice Charlotte caught him watching her. Not the old way, not the assessing, careful way. And both times he didn't look away first. When the rain finally softened and the children started to relax, Emma gathered Samuel off his chair and herded both younger children to bed with the efficient authority that was her particular gift. William followed without being asked. Emma was the last one left, and she paused in the doorway. She looked at her father, then at Charlotte. "I'll be in the back," she said, and pulled the door shut behind her. The cabin was very quiet. John stood up. He moved to the window, stood there with his back to her. "I kept things from you," he said. "Yes," Charlotte said. "I had reasons." He turned around. His face was stripped down to something honest. "They weren't good enough reasons, but I want you to understand what they were." Charlotte looked at him across the table. "Then tell me." He sat back down, folded his hands, and for the first time since she'd arrived, John Tyndale told her the truth. Not part of it, not the edge of it, all of it. He told her about his father and the estate and the conditions of the inheritance. He told her about Miriam, about the marriage that had seemed like everything and turned out to be a trap, about the debts that came due and the men who came to collect them, and the years he'd spent working himself raw to protect 4 children from the fallout of a marriage built on half-truths. He told her about the woman who had come after, the city woman, who had asked about the property within hours of arriving. He told her about the second woman and the third, each one of whom had seemed, in the beginning, like a reason to hope, and each of whom had shown him, in the end, something that confirmed what fear had been telling him since Miriam died. He told her all of it, with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on her face, and his voice steady in the way of a man who has decided to stop managing the truth. Charlotte listened to everything. When he finished, the silence between them was different from every silence that had come before. Not closed, not guarded, just open. Empty in the way a room is empty when it's finally been cleared of everything that was cluttering it. "I was wrong," John said, "about the way I went about it." He held her gaze. "I was not wrong to be afraid, but I was wrong to make that your burden." Charlotte looked at the man across the table, at the worn hands and the honest face and the eyes that were, for the first time, not watching her for what she might do wrong. She thought about 4 children and a one-room cabin and a chest with a document in it and a name that had lived in this family like a wound that hadn't closed. She thought about a little girl who had climbed into her bed and said, "Don't disappear," with the absolute certainty of someone who had already seen what disappearing looked like. She thought about what it cost a person to tell the whole truth when they'd been holding it for years. And then Charlotte Voss, who was not a foolish woman, who was not a forgiving woman by instinct, who had been tested and found it unfair and said so plainly, looked at John Tyndale and made a decision that came not from her head, but from something older and more stubborn in her, the part that had always believed that people could earn their way back from the things that fear had made them do. "I'm not leaving," she said. John looked at her. "But if you ever," she said quietly, "keep anything from me again, anything that matters, anything that touches this family or this life we're building, I will not be so easy about it the second time." Her voice was level and clean as a blade. "I am your partner, John, not your trial, not your test. Your partner. And I need you to decide right now whether that's something you can accept." He looked at her for a long time. "Yes," he said, and meant it in a way she could hear in every syllable. Charlotte nodded, stood up, pushed her chair back in. "Then tomorrow," she said, "you're going to take me to see this house." She walked to her room, and this time, John did not stay at the table alone. He was up before her. Charlotte heard him moving in the kitchen before the sun had fully decided what it was doing, and when she came out, He was standing at the counter with 2 cups of coffee already poured, and his hat in his hand, and the particular stillness of a man who had made a decision in the night and was holding it carefully. The way you hold something fragile, you're not sure yet how to carry. He turned when he heard her. "You still want to go?" he said. Not a question. He already knew the answer. "I said I did," Charlotte said. She took the coffee he held out. "I meant it." He nodded once. "Children will need to be settled first." "I already spoke to Emma." Something crossed his face at that. Surprise, maybe. Or the beginning of understanding that the woman standing in his kitchen operated several steps ahead of what he'd been giving her credit for. He put his hat on. "Then we'll go after breakfast," he said. Emma had, in fact, taken the news with the equanimity of someone who had been expecting it. Charlotte had knocked on her door in the early gray of the morning and said simply, "Your father is taking me to see the house today. I need you to hold things here." Emma had looked at her from her pillow with those dark, adult eyes and said, "All right," and that had been the whole conversation. William was harder, not because he said anything. William rarely said anything. But because when he understood what was happening, when he put together that his father and Charlotte were riding out together toward the property he'd known about his whole life and never been taken to, something in his face went complicated. Not angry, more like a boy who has been waiting a long time for something, and now that it's happening, doesn't know what to do with the waiting ending. Charlotte stopped beside him on her way to the horses. "You've seen it," she said. "The house." William glanced at her. "Once, when I was 8, Papa took me." He looked at the ground. "He never took us back." "Why not?" William shrugged one shoulder. "Said there was nothing there worth going to yet." He looked up. "I think he just didn't want us to get used to something he wasn't sure we could keep." Charlotte looked at this boy, 11 years old and already fluent in the language his father had been speaking in silence for years, and felt something ache in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite tenderness, but lived in the neighborhood of both. "When we come back," she said, "I'll tell you everything." William looked at her for a moment. Then he stepped back and let her pass. They rode in silence for the first mile. Charlotte had learned by now that John's silences had different textures. Some were closed, walls, not spaces. Others were just him thinking, processing, working something through the way he worked everything through, methodically and without waste. This silence felt like the second kind. He was beside her on his gray horse, and she was on the smaller bay they'd given her use of. And the morning was cool still from the storm, the ground dark with it, and the world smelled like wet earth and distance. It was John who spoke first. "I want to explain something," he said. Charlotte kept her eyes forward. "I'm listening." "When my father died," he said, "he left me everything. The ranch, the house, the land. 4,000 acres and a deed and a letter that said—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "The letter said that he hoped I'd find someone to share it with who deserved it. That was his word. Deserved." He paused. "My father was not a soft man. He didn't use words like that loosely." "What did he mean by it?" Charlotte asked. "He meant what he'd seen in his own life," John said. "He married my mother for the wrong reasons, and she married him for the wrong reasons, and they spent 40 years making each other pay for it." His voice was even. "He didn't want that for me. He thought wealth made it worse, made it harder to know what was real." Charlotte thought about that. "So he left you the wealth anyway?" "He left me the choice," John said, "whether to use it as a test or a foundation." He looked at her sideways. "I chose wrong." She didn't argue with him. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I want you to understand," he said, "that when we get there, when you see it, I need you to know it was never about whether you were good enough. It was about whether I could trust my own judgment again." His jaw worked. "After Miriam, I didn't trust it. Not for a long time." Charlotte looked at him. At the profile of a man who had spent 2 years sitting on 4,000 acres and a house he wouldn't live in because he couldn't decide if what he felt was real or just the next version of the same mistake. "Your judgment is fine, John," she said. "You were just asking it to answer a question it couldn't answer for you." He was quiet for a moment. "What question is that?" "Whether someone will stay," she said. "You can't know that in advance. You just have to decide to risk it." He turned to look at her fully then, riding, both of them, side by side on wet ground in the early morning. And the look on his face was one she was going to remember. Not because it was dramatic, because it was simple. Because it was just a man seeing something clearly for the first time and not looking away from it. He turned back to the trail. They rode on. She heard it before she saw it. Not the house, something else. Voices. Coming from the direction they were heading, carried on the cool air. More than one voice, and the particular quality of voices that were not in conversation, but in confrontation. John heard it too. His whole body changed. He urged his horse forward, and Charlotte followed, and they came over the low rise, and she saw it. The house, yes, 2 stories and solid and nothing like the cabin, built with the kind of intention that said permanence. But in front of it, 3 horses and 2 men she didn't recognize, and 1 man she did. Gerald Holt. He was standing at the front of the house with a rolled document in his hand and a younger man beside him with a surveyor's rod. And they were moving with the confidence of people who believed they had every right to be exactly where they were. John pulled up his horse hard. "Holt," he said. His voice had gone to iron. Holt turned. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man who had calculated the timing of this encounter and found it satisfactory. "Tyndale," Holt said. "Glad you're here, actually. Saves me a ride." He held up the document. "Filed this morning with the county. Preemptive claim, given the estate transition deadline. Fully legal." He smiled the way men smile when they believe the ground they're standing on belongs to them. "You've got 6 weeks. After that, if the deed transfer isn't complete—" "Get off my land," John said. Holt's smile didn't move. "It's not your land until you say it is. That's the whole point." He looked at Charlotte then, deliberate and assessing. "Your wife understand how this works? Maybe she'd like to know that a man who won't commit to his own property for 2 years isn't the most reliable kind of—" John was off his horse before Holt finished the sentence. Charlotte's hand shot out and caught his arm. He stopped. Just barely. She felt the tension in him like a rope pulled to its last inch. His eyes were on Holt, and his jaw was locked, and she could feel the decision he was making in real time. The one between what he wanted to do and what he understood to be right. "John," she said quietly. He held still. She turned to Holt. She looked at him the way she looked at things that were unpleasant but manageable. Directly, without drama. "Mr. Holt," she said, "I suggest you take your surveyor and ride back to town before my husband decides his patience has run out. The deed will be filed. You have my word on that." She held his gaze. "And I assure you that my word is worth considerably more than whatever that document is." Holt looked at her. The smile faltered, just slightly, just enough. "6 weeks, ma'am," he said. "I heard you the first time," Charlotte said. He rolled up his document, tipped his hat with the performative courtesy of a man retreating without admitting it, climbed on his horse. His surveyor followed. They rode away. John stood beside her with his arms still taut under her hand. She didn't let go until she heard the hoofbeats fade. Then he looked at her. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "No," she agreed. "But you would have hit him, and hitting him would have given him exactly what he wanted." She released his arm. "I am not going to let someone like Gerald Holt be the reason this family loses what's ours." John looked at her for a long moment. "What's ours?" he said. "Yes," she said. Steady, clear. "Ours." Something in John's face broke open a second time. Different from last night. Different from the storm. This was quieter, deeper. The kind of opening that doesn't close again after. He turned toward the house. "Come on," he said. "Let me show you." She walked through every room. She didn't gush. She didn't perform amazement. She moved through the house the way she moved through every task. Steadily, paying attention, cataloging what was there and what was needed and what could be made into something good. John walked beside her and said almost nothing. He let her look. That, she understood, was itself a kind of trust. He was watching her face, the way he'd watched her face since she arrived. But the quality of it had changed. He wasn't waiting for her to reveal something suspicious. He was just watching. Just being with her in the same space, while something new settled between them. "Sarah's room should face east," Charlotte said in the upstairs hallway. John looked at her. "She wakes up scared in the dark," Charlotte said. "East-facing rooms get the morning light first." She looked at the rooms ahead of her. "William will want to be closest to the outside. He'll be up before everyone, and he won't want to wake the others." She turned. "Samuel needs space for his books. He has 3 hidden under his mattress at the cabin. Did you know that?" John's expression shifted. Something soft and stunned moved through it. "No," he said. "He's hungry for it," Charlotte said. "Reading, learning. He'd be a remarkable student if anyone gave him the chance." She turned to look at John fully. "There's a school teacher in the next county. I asked in town last week. She takes private pupils. I'd like to speak to her." John stood in the hallway of the house he hadn't been able to commit to and looked at his wife. His wife who had been there less than a month and had already learned things about his children that he hadn't known. And he was quiet for a long time. "Whatever you think is right," he said, and meant it in a way that had nothing managed about it. Charlotte turned back to the hallway. "Emma gets the biggest room," she said. "Why Emma?" "Because she's earned it," Charlotte said simply. "She's been running a household since she was 10. She deserves a room that says someone noticed." John was still. "Charlotte," he said. She turned. He crossed the hallway in 2 steps and stopped just in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to look at him. And his face was doing something she'd never seen it do. Not ashamed, not guarded, not careful, just open. Just a man standing in front of a woman and not knowing what to do with all of it, and deciding, maybe for the first time in years, that not knowing was all right. "I don't know how to do this," he said quietly. "Being this. Trusting someone with all of it." His voice was low and rough. "I've been alone with it for so long that I don't—" "I know," Charlotte said. "I don't want to get it wrong again." "You're going to get things wrong," she said. "So am I. That's not the question." She held his gaze. "The question is whether we tell each other the truth when we do." He looked at her. Then he reached out and took her hand. Not romantically, or not only that. The way a man takes hold of something he's decided to stop being afraid of losing. "Yes," he said. "We will." They were riding back when Emma's figure appeared at a distance, moving fast toward them on foot, and Charlotte felt the shift in the air before she understood what was wrong. Emma didn't run. Emma was not a girl who ran. When Charlotte saw her running, her stomach dropped. John pushed his horse forward and was down beside his daughter in seconds. What happened? Emma was breathing hard. Her composure, that careful, constructed composure she wore like armor, was cracked straight down the middle. "It's Sarah," she said. "She's burning up. Started an hour ago. I sent William for the doctor, but—" Her voice broke. First time Charlotte had ever heard it break. "She's asking for you, Papa. She keeps asking for you and Charlotte." John was already turning his horse. Charlotte was already riding. Sarah was small and too hot and wrong in the way sick children were wrong, with that particular frightening stillness that was different from sleep. She was on the bed, and William was sitting beside her, with his jaw locked tight in the way of a boy who is terrified and refusing to perform it. And Samuel was in the corner, with his arms wrapped around himself, looking younger than 9. Charlotte was beside the bed before she'd fully registered crossing the room. She pressed the back of her hand to Sarah's forehead. Too hot. Much too hot. "How long has she been like this?" she asked. "Since mid-morning," Emma said. "She was fine at breakfast. She started coughing after, and then she went quiet, and I felt her head, and—" "Get me cold water," Charlotte said, "and every clean cloth you have." She turned to Samuel. "Samuel, look at me." He looked up. "I need you to go sit on the porch and watch for the doctor. The moment you see anyone on that road, you call out. Can you do that?" He nodded. The focus gave him somewhere to put the fear. "Go," she said. He went. John was on the other side of the bed, Sarah's small hand in both of his, and he was speaking to her in a voice Charlotte had never heard from him. Low and quiet and completely unguarded. The voice of a father talking to his child when he doesn't care who hears him. "I'm here, sweetheart," he said. "I'm right here. You hear me? Papa's here." Sarah's eyes fluttered. "Charlotte?" she whispered. "I'm here, baby," Charlotte said. She took Sarah's other hand. "I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." Sarah's fingers tightened on hers. John looked up across the bed. His eyes found Charlotte's and held there, above their sick child, above all of it, in the small, terrible space of a parent's fear. And something passed between them that required no words at all. Something that had been building since she'd arrived and had finally found its form. They were in this together, not as a test, not as a transaction, not as two people still deciding whether to trust each other. Together. The doctor arrived within the hour. His name was Marsh, and he was calm and thorough, and Charlotte liked him immediately for the way he spoke to Sarah rather than over her. He examined her, asked his questions, gave his instructions. Fever, chest congestion from the weeks of damp and cold in a cabin that didn't hold heat. Serious enough to watch carefully. Not, thank God, beyond managing with the right care. He pulled John aside in the hallway while Charlotte stayed with Sarah. She could hear the low murmur of their voices. She didn't try to make out the words. She kept her attention on Sarah, on cooling the fever, on the cloths, on the quiet, steady work of caring for a child who trusted her. When John came back in, his face had settled into something she recognized. The controlled, forward-facing expression of a man who has received difficult information and is now moving through it. "She needs to be kept warm and still," he said. "Doctor says the cabin—" "We need to move her," Charlotte said. John looked at her. "The house," she said. "The ranch house. It's solid, and it holds heat, and it's ours." She held his gaze. "I know the deed isn't filed yet. I don't care. That house belongs to your family, and your daughter needs it. We move today." John was still. Outside, she heard Samuel calling from the porch, calling to no one, Just his voice, carrying across the open land the way a boy's voice does when he's doing the job he was given, and doing it faithfully, even though the danger has already passed. Emma appeared in the doorway. She looked at her father. She looked at Charlotte. She read the room the way she read everything, completely and immediately. "I'll start packing," she said. William didn't say anything when John told him. He just went to his room and came back 5 minutes later with his things in a bundle and his horse's bridles in his other hand, ready to work. Samuel, told they were moving to the big house, said, "Really?" with such stunned disbelief that Charlotte had to turn away so he wouldn't see her smile. Sarah, when she was told, simply said, "Will Charlotte be there?" "I will," Charlotte said. "Okay," Sarah said, and closed her eyes. They had the wagon loaded by mid-afternoon. John lifted Sarah himself, wrapped in every blanket Emma could find, and carried her to the wagon with the steady, deliberate care of a man who has understood, too late but not too recently, what he almost let his pride cost his family. He climbed up beside Charlotte on the wagon seat. He handed her the reins. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was quiet and practical, and it said everything that a grand gesture would have cheapened. Charlotte took the reins and clicked the horses forward, and John sat beside her with his children behind them and the ranch house ahead, and the deed that would be filed in the morning, and the life that was finally moving toward what it had always been meant to be. They rode in silence for a little while. Then William called from the back, "Is there a room with a window that faces the horses?" "Yes," John called back. "Can I have it?" John glanced at Charlotte. She didn't say anything, just kept her eyes on the road, but the corner of her mouth lifted. "Ask Charlotte," John said. "She's the one who planned the rooms." There was a pause. "Charlotte," William said. "Yes, William?" "Can I have the room with the window that faces the horses?" "Yes," Charlotte said. "It's yours." Another pause. Then, very quietly, so quiet she almost missed it over the sound of the wheels and the horses and the wide summer afternoon. "Thank you." Charlotte kept her eyes on the road ahead and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled since the moment she'd stepped off that wagon 3 weeks ago into a life she hadn't entirely understood. It wasn't fixed. Nothing was fixed in a single afternoon. There would be more hard days and more hard conversations, and the deed still needed filing, and Holt was still out there, and the children still had adjusting to do, and John Tyndale was still, at his core, a man who had to work at trust the way other men worked at a fence post, slowly, with both hands, making sure it would hold before he leaned on it. But this, the wagon moving forward, the children behind her, John beside her, the house waiting, this was real. This was the foundation, and Charlotte Voss, who had left Missouri looking for a reason that mattered, held the reins and drove her family home. Sarah's fever broke on the 3rd morning. Charlotte knew it before she opened her eyes. She'd been sleeping in the chair beside the bed, the way she'd slept for 2 nights running, and sometime in the deep quiet before dawn she felt the quality of the room change. The tense, watchful atmosphere of a sick room going still and soft. She leaned forward and pressed her hand to Sarah's forehead and felt cool skin under her palm, and let out a breath that had been sitting in her chest for 48 hours. Sarah opened her eyes. "I'm hungry," she said. Charlotte laughed. It came out a little broken, a little wet around the edges, but she laughed, and Sarah looked at her with the mild curiosity of a child who doesn't entirely understand why adults cry when good things happen. "That's the best thing you could have said to me," Charlotte told her. "Can I have eggs?" Sarah asked. "You can have anything you want," Charlotte said. She went to find John. He was in the hallway, which meant he'd been outside the door, which meant he hadn't slept either. He looked up when she came out and read her face before she said a word, and something happened to his expression that she had no name for. Relief so deep it looked almost like pain, the kind that comes when you've been braced against the worst for so long that standing down hurts in its own way. "She's asking for eggs," Charlotte said. John sat down on the floor of the hallway with his back against the wall. Just sat down, right there, and put his face in his hands for a moment. Charlotte sat down beside him. She didn't say anything. She put her hand on his arm and left it there, and let him have the moment. And after a while, he straightened up and looked at the ceiling and exhaled slowly. "I thought," he started. "I know," she said. "When her mother—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "Miriam got sick the same way, started the same, and I couldn't—" He shook his head. "I couldn't fix it. I did everything, and I couldn't fix it." Charlotte tightened her hand on his arm. "This is not that," she said. "Sarah is going to be fine." He looked at her. "Because of you," he said. "The way you managed it, the cloths, the water, the way you kept her calm." "Because of us," Charlotte said firmly. "Don't do that. Don't make this mine and take yourself out of it. You were beside that bed the same as I was." He held her gaze. "Together," she said, the same word she'd used in the house, across the bed, when their eyes had met above their sick child. John nodded slowly. "Together," he said. Down the hall, Emma's door opened and she appeared in it, hair loose, which Charlotte had never seen, which made her look suddenly and startlingly like a young girl rather than the small adult she spent most of her hours being. "I heard Charlotte laugh," Emma said. "Is she—" "Asking for eggs," Charlotte said. Emma closed her eyes for 1 second, one single second of pure, unguarded relief. Then she opened them and straightened her shoulders and said, in her most efficient voice, "I'll start the fire." She was already halfway down the stairs. By the time Sarah was sitting up in bed, eating her eggs with the appetite of someone who had been cheated out of 2 days of meals and intended to recover the deficit, the whole house had shifted. Something had loosened in it. The particular tightness of those 2 days, everyone moving quietly, everyone watching, everyone holding themselves slightly in reserve, the way people do when they're afraid of what might happen, had released. And in its place was something that felt, for the first time, like a house where people were allowed to breathe. William brought Sarah a glass of water and set it down without being asked, and then stood there, looking at his little sister with a fierceness that was entirely helpless and entirely William. "You scared me," he told her. Sarah looked up at him with egg on her chin. "I was asleep," she said. "I didn't do it on purpose." William turned around and walked out of the room before she could see his face do anything he didn't want it to do. Samuel climbed onto the end of the bed, with complete disregard for the idea that Sarah might need space, and said, "I thought of 4 new book titles while you were sick. Want to hear them?" "Yes," Sarah said. He told her. She laughed at 2 of them. Charlotte watched from the doorway and felt the full weight of what she had, what she hadn't had a month ago, and what she would not give back for anything in the world. John filed the deed 3 days later. He came back from town with the receipt in his coat pocket and set it on the kitchen table in front of Charlotte without ceremony, the way he did things that mattered. Quietly, directly, without performance. She picked it up, read it, set it back down. "How did it feel?" she asked. He sat down across from her, thought about the question the way he thought about things, honestly. "Like I'd been holding my breath for 2 years," he said, and finally stopped. Charlotte nodded. "Holt was at the land office when I got there," John said. Her eyes sharpened. "And?" "He wasn't happy." John's voice was even. "He'd had people watching the deadline. Thought I'd wait too long." The corner of his mouth moved. He underestimated the 6-week timeline. He underestimated you, Charlotte said. He underestimated us, John said. And this time it was him using the word, giving it back to her, and she felt it land with the same weight she'd meant it to have the first time. Holt was not done. She knew that. Men like Gerald Holt were never done after one defeat. They regrouped and recalculated and came back with different angles, and she was not so optimistic as to think a filed deed was the end of it. But it was a wall between him and what he wanted, and walls mattered. "There's something else," John said. Charlotte looked at him. He pulled a second paper from his coat, unfolded it carefully, and set it in front of her. It was a letter, handwritten, formal, from an address in the county seat. She read it once, then again. "The County Education Board," she said. "They're looking to establish a schoolhouse," John said. "Permanent one, not just a traveling teacher. They need land for it. Someone with standing to put it forward." He paused. "I put my name on it this morning, before I filed the deed." Charlotte looked up from the letter. "You donated the land," she said. 2 acres on the south edge of the property," he said. "Good flat ground, easy for families from 3 directions to reach." He held her gaze. "You talked about the school teacher, about Samuel, about what he needed." He nodded at the letter. "I paid attention." Charlotte set the letter down. She was quiet for a moment, and the quiet had a fullness to it. Not the loaded, watchful quiet of their first weeks together, but the kind of quiet that comes when something has been said that doesn't need adding to. "Your father," she said finally. "He said he hoped you'd find someone who deserved it." John looked at her. "I think," Charlotte said carefully, "that he meant both of you." The town found out about the deed within a week. That was how towns worked. Information moved faster than anything on horseback, carried by the ordinary commerce of people who knew each other's business, because everyone's business was the same business in a place that small. The reactions were varied. Most people were civil. A few were more than civil. 2 families came out to welcome the Tyndales properly to the property, bringing food and handshakes and the particular warmth of neighbors who had been waiting to see how a situation would resolve itself before committing to a side. Charlotte received them and managed the conversations with the ease of a woman who understood social mechanics and chose to use them carefully. The hardware man in town, a Mr. Davies, stopped John on the street and shook his hand for a long time and said he'd been hoping the Tyndale land wouldn't go to Holt's people. John thanked him with the brief, genuine courtesy that was his natural mode and moved on. Holt himself sent a letter. Charlotte was the one who opened it. She read it, set it down, and said to John, "He's suggesting a land boundary dispute. He says the surveyor found an inconsistency in the original property lines." John's expression hardened. "That surveyor works for Holt." "I know," Charlotte said. "That's why we're going to get our own surveyor before he files anything." She looked at John. "Do you have a lawyer?" John looked at her. "I had a lawyer. He retired last year." "Then we need a new one," Charlotte said. "This week, not next." John stared at her for a moment with an expression she'd come to know. The one that appeared when she moved faster than he'd been moving, and he was catching up to where she already was. "Do you know anyone?" "I know of a man in the county seat," she said. "My late husband used him for a property matter. He's good." She paused. "He's also expensive." "We can afford expensive," John said. The words came out differently than they would have a month ago. Not strained, not complicated, just plain and true. They could afford it. They could afford it, and they were going to use that fact to protect what was theirs. Charlotte was already writing the letter. The lawyer's name was Caldwell, and he arrived 4 days later on a Tuesday, and the meeting at the kitchen table lasted 2 hours and covered every inch of the property documentation, the deed history, the original survey, and Holt's letter with its carefully worded threat. Emma sat in on the meeting. John had started to ask her to wait in the other room. Old habit, the reflex of a man who had managed everything alone for years. But Charlotte had said quietly, "She stays." And John had looked at his daughter's face and said nothing more about it. Emma sat and listened with the focused, silent attention she gave everything. And when Caldwell asked a question about the original property line that none of them could immediately answer, it was Emma who said, "The original survey map is in the bottom of the document chest. Papa keeps it in the back room." Everyone at the table looked at her. "I know where everything is," Emma said, with complete simplicity. "I've been managing this family's papers since I was 11. Caldwell looked at John. "Smart girl," he said. John looked at his daughter, at the girl he had leaned on for 3 years without fully seeing what it was costing her. The girl who had become competent out of necessity and had never once complained about the weight of it. And something moved through his expression that was quiet and enormous at the same time. "She is," John said. "She always has been." Emma looked at the table. The back of her neck went slightly pink, but she went and got the map. Caldwell left with everything he needed and a handshake from John, and the distinct impression, Charlotte thought, of a man who had come expecting a simple land matter and was leaving with respect for the family he'd just agreed to represent. After he rode out, the 4 children and 2 adults stood in the front room of the ranch house in the late afternoon, and there was a moment, just a moment, where no one moved and no one spoke, and the house held all of them in the particular quiet of somewhere that has finally become what it was always meant to be. Samuel broke it, because Samuel always broke silences. It was one of his finest qualities. "Can we get a dog?" he said. John looked at Charlotte. Charlotte looked at John. "One dog," John said. Samuel made a sound that could only be described as victorious, and turned to tell Sarah, who was standing beside him on slightly unsteady legs, her first day fully upright since the fever. And Sarah's face opened into the widest smile Charlotte had ever seen on it. William, standing by the window, said nothing, but his shoulders dropped and his mouth curved, and Charlotte filed that moment away in the same place she filed all of them. All the small, accumulating evidence of a family coming back to life. 3 weeks later, Holt's boundary challenge collapsed. Caldwell sent a letter that was 3 paragraphs of clean, precise, legal language, amounting to, the surveyor's findings were based on an incorrect baseline measurement. The original Tyndale property lines were sound and legally unimpeachable. And any further challenge would be answered in court with documentation that would make for uncomfortable reading for anyone associated with the claim. Charlotte read the letter aloud at supper. When she finished, William said, "So he lost?" "He lost," John said. William picked up his fork and went back to his food with the satisfied composure of someone who had believed in the outcome all along and was simply glad to see the record reflect it. Samuel asked if they could get a second dog. "No," said John. "What if it's a small one?" "Samuel," Emma said, "I'm just asking." "No," said Charlotte. Samuel looked at Charlotte, then at John, then at the ceiling, which had apparently become very interesting. "Okay," he said. Sarah giggled. She'd been giggling more since the fever broke, as if the sickness had cleared something out of her and left her lighter, more certain of things. She giggled now and leaned against Charlotte's arm, and Charlotte put her hand on the girl's hair without thinking about it, the way you do things that have already become instinct. John watched her do it. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The conversation with Emma happened in the kitchen on a Wednesday evening after the others had gone to bed. Charlotte had stayed to clean up, and Emma had stayed to help, the way Emma always did. And they'd been working in that comfortable shared silence for a while, when Emma set down what she was holding and said, "I want to go to school." Charlotte turned. Emma was looking at the window, not at her. Her voice was matter-of-fact, the way she delivered everything important, without decoration, straight to the point. "I know Samuel's the one who's been talked about, and I'm glad about that. He needs it." She paused. "But I'm 13, and I haven't had real schooling since Mama died, and She stopped. Her jaw worked. "I don't want to spend my whole life knowing how to run a house. I want to know other things, too." Charlotte set down the cloth in her hands. She walked to Emma and stood beside her and said nothing for a moment. Then, "I was going to bring it up with your father this week," she said. Emma looked at her. "You were?" "I've been writing to a boarding school in the county seat," Charlotte said. "They take girls your age. They have a strong academic program. Reading, mathematics, natural philosophy." She paused. "It would mean you'd be away during the term, home for summers and holidays." She held Emma's gaze. "I wanted to talk to you before I talked to your father, because it's your life, and it should be your decision first." Emma stared at her. "You did that," she said, "before I even asked." "I noticed," Charlotte said simply. "That's all. I paid attention." Emma looked at the window again. Her throat moved, and Charlotte watched the armor, that careful, constructed, necessary armor that this girl had been building since she was 10 years old, come down, just for a moment, just long enough. "Mama used to say," Emma said quietly, "that the most dangerous thing a woman could be was educated." A pause. "She said it like it was a compliment." "It is," Charlotte said. Emma turned to look at her fully. Her eyes were bright but steady. "Okay," she said. "Talk to Papa." John said yes before Charlotte had finished explaining. Not impulsively. That wasn't John's way. He heard her out, and there was a moment midway through where his expression did something complex and old. Some grief and some guilt moving through it at the same time. The recognition of a man understanding something he should have understood sooner. And then it cleared, and he said yes, and it was simple and complete. "She's been carrying this house since she was 10, he said, after. His voice was low. "Yes," Charlotte said. "I leaned on her too hard," he said. "I knew it, and I let it go on because I didn't know what else to do." "You were doing what you could," Charlotte said. "And now you're doing something better. That's what matters." He was quiet. "I keep thinking," he said, "about all the things I should have done differently." "John." She waited until he looked at her. "You can carry that weight and let it pull you backward, or you can set it down and use what you've learned." She held his gaze. "Your children don't need your guilt. They need your presence. There's a difference." He looked at her for a long time, the way he'd been looking at her lately, not measuring, not cautious, just seeing her, just letting her be seen. "How did you get so clear-eyed about things?" he said. "I had a lot of empty rooms to think in," she said, "for a long time." The schoolhouse broke ground in the fall. Charlotte was there when they laid the first timber, standing beside John with Sarah's hand in hers, and Samuel talking at high volume to anyone who would listen about everything he was going to learn, and William standing slightly apart with his arms crossed, and his face doing the thing it did when he was feeling something he hadn't categorized yet. The county board chairman shook John's hand and made a speech about community and progress and the future of the territory. And John stood through it with the patience of a man who appreciates the sentiment but would rather be working. When it was over, Charlotte felt his hand find hers. Not reaching for it, just finding it, easy and certain. The way you reach for something you've stopped being afraid of losing. She looked at him. He was looking at the timber and the people and the land, his land, their land, and his expression was the quietest she had ever seen it. Not closed, just still. The stillness that comes after a long storm, when the air has finally gone clean. "Your father would have liked this," Charlotte said. John was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said, "he would have." He tightened his hand around hers, and she tightened hers back, and that was all. That was enough. Some months later, after Emma had left for school and sent back 3 letters in the first month alone, each one denser and more alive than the last, after Samuel had started lessons with the county teacher and come home every evening talking so fast his words tripped over each other, after William had, without announcement or ceremony, begun teaching Sarah to handle the smallest horse, patient and serious and utterly himself about it, Charlotte stood at the window of the ranch house in the early morning and thought about Missouri. She thought about the house with the curtains, and the neighbor with the preserves, and the rooms that had been comfortable and empty. She thought about the kitchen table where she'd read John Tyndale's letter the 4th time, the 5th time, the 6th, trying to decide if it was reasonable. It hadn't been reasonable. That was the thing. It had been a leap made in the dark by a woman who was lonely enough and stubborn enough and hungry enough for something real, that she'd signed her name to a life she couldn't see yet. And this was what she hadn't been able to see. Not the house, or the land, or the legal victory over Gerald Holt. Not even the children, though she loved every one of them in ways that were specific and different and hers entirely. What she hadn't been able to see was the ordinary texture of it. The coffee cups in the morning. John's hand finding hers without looking. Sarah's laugh that had gotten louder since the fever. William's voice coming through the wall late in the evening, talking quietly to the horses, the way he talked to almost nothing else. Samuel's constant noise. And Emma's letters, and the particular rightness of being a person who was needed, and who needed in return. She had come looking for a reason that mattered. She was standing inside it. John came up behind her. She heard him, heard his step, which she knew now the way you know the sounds of a house you live in, by feel, without thinking. He stopped beside her at the window. "Sarah's asking for you," he said. "She wants you to braid her hair. Tell her I'll be there in a minute." He didn't move. He stood beside her looking out the window at the land, at the morning light and the land and the life they had built out of secrets and fear, and the letter that should not have been enough, and somehow had been. "Charlotte," he said. She turned to look at him. He looked back at her with those dark, honest eyes. No caution in them now, no armor, no calculation. Just the man. Just John. "Thank you," he said, "for staying." Charlotte looked at this man, this difficult, guarded, fundamentally decent man who had hidden everything he owned and tested what he feared to lose, and been wrong about the method and right about the love, and felt the full weight of what it had taken for both of them to arrive here, what it had cost, and what it had built, and what it meant that they were standing here, both of them, on the other side of it. "I told you I wasn't going to disappear," she said. His mouth curved, slow and genuine, the way his smiles always were, reluctant, like they'd been earned. "You did," he said. "And you didn't." Charlotte turned toward the hallway, toward Sarah and her braids, and the noise of the morning coming up through the house, toward all of it. And she didn't look back. because everything worth turning toward was already right in front of her. And she had never been the kind of woman who looked back when she knew where she was going. The Tyndale Ranch stood solid in the morning light. 4,000 acres of it, and the schoolhouse going up on the south edge, and a family inside its walls that had been broken and scarred and tested and had chosen, every last one of them, to stay. That was the whole of it. That was everything.